All right, Psalm 81, where you're going to want to bookmark it. We're going to go somewhere else tonight. So, in our study of Psalm 81, we're going to start at another passage. But interesting, Chris actually kind of directed me this way. In his book, Learning to Love the Psalms, Robert Godfrey, he's a teacher with Ligonier Ministries. In his book, Learning to Love the Psalms, he writes, Psalm 81 is a remarkable and important psalm in the Psalter. And he begins by saying that this psalm gives us some specifics of the occasion in which it was to be sung, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But he goes on to say, even more remarkable than the occasion for writing Psalm 81 is the place of this psalm in the Psalter. In a sense, it is the central psalm in the book of Psalms. When I first heard that, I said, 81 isn't half of 150, right? You did that too, didn't you? Yeah. But he goes on, and it makes sense. He says, of course, it does not stand at the numerical center of 150 psalms, but it is the central psalm in the central book of the Psalter. So if you remember that there are 5 books in the Psalter, book 3 is the central one, and Psalm 81 is the center psalm of that. So in that sense, it is the central psalm of the book. He goes on to say, and at the center of Psalm 81 is verse 8. Verse 8, which says, Hear, O my people, while I admonish you, O Israel, if you would but listen to me. He says, for all the mysteries of God's providence with Israel, here is the central truth. Israel was suffering a crisis of exile because she had not listened to her God. So, at the center of the book of Psalms is book 3. It's the central book of the Psalms. In the center of book 3 is Psalm 81, and at the center of Psalm 81 is, O Israel, if you would listen to me. And that word, listen, is the Hebrew word shema. Shema. And that is the key word in this psalm. It's found in verse 5, verse 8, verse 11, and verse 13. And so we're going to start our discussion of Psalm 81 by going to the Shema, which is Deuteronomy chapter 6, which I think is what Asaph is thinking about, meditating upon as he pens Psalm 81. So I even gave you a bookmark, right? You got a bookmark right here. Just put that in Psalm 81, and we'll turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I think that not just the actual Shema, which means hear or listen, but all of Deuteronomy chapter 6 really is in the background of Psalm 81. So let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I'm just going to read the whole thing. We won't spend a lot of time discussing Deuteronomy 6 because we're going to talk about Psalm 81, but we want to be familiar with the background, and this is Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 and 5 are some of the most important verses in the Bible. So we want to be familiar with this as we go to Psalm 81. So this is what Moses writes in Deuteronomy chapter 6. He said, now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that Yahweh your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear Yahweh your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, there's the word Shema, hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as Yahweh, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Interesting. Yahweh's name is mentioned 3 times there. I think it's significant when it's just in a triplet, because God is triune. Verse 6, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And when Yahweh your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget Yahweh, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is Yahweh your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you, for Yahweh your God in your midst is a jealous God, lest the anger of Yahweh your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth. You shall not put Yahweh your God to the test, as you tested him at Massah. You shall diligently keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, and his testimonies and his statutes which he has commanded you. And you shall do what is right and good in the sight of Yahweh, that it may go well with you, and that you may go in and take possession of the good land that Yahweh swore to give to your fathers, by thrusting out all your enemies from before you, as Yahweh has promised. When your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that Yahweh our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And Yahweh showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And Yahweh commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear Yahweh our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before Yahweh our God, as he has commanded us. Right. So we have several times it's mentioned that these are statutes and rules and commandments that they're supposed to keep. But what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to hear and they're supposed to obey. And if they hear and they teach it to their children, then it will go well for them. But if they refuse, if they forget, then the curses are going to come upon them. Right. We saw this, if you go back to the book of Psalms, we saw this when we were looking at Psalm 78 as another passage of Scripture that I think alludes to Psalm 78, where he talks about passing this on to coming generations, even the generations that aren't born, so that they might learn to fear God. They might fear that they might learn to set their hope on God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And so I think also Asaph is alluding to Deuteronomy 6 there. But here, he's really bringing out the emphasis on hearing, listen, so that it will go well. And so that really is the central theme, the central message of the psalm. The psalm, I think, is, you guessed it, a chiasm. But we're not going to look at it as really a tight chiasm tonight, but we're going to look at it in 3 headings, 3 sections. And it's all going to deal with remembering and listening. So verses 1 through 7, we have a call to remember how, in the past, God listened. So we see in verse 5 that I hear, I shema, a language I had not known, and then we see how God delivered Israel. So verses 1 through 7, a call to remember how in the past the Lord listened. In the middle of the psalm is verses 8 through 12, and it's an admonishment to listen. It's an admonishment to listen. And then in verses 13 through 16, we have a promise of future blessings that will come through listening. All right? So remember in the past how God listened. Listen, and there's going to be future blessings, future hope, future promises if you would listen. Okay? So it's all about listening tonight. So maybe tonight when you go home and you tell the kids to get ready for bed and they don't obey, and you say, are you listening to me? Maybe that will remind you to ask the same question of yourself. Am I listening? Yes. Hear, oh my children. Yes. But you can use that. Kids are a great reminder, a great picture of your own relationship with God. So when you're asking your kids, are you listening? You can ask yourself, am I listening? Am I hearing? All right. So let's walk through this psalm tonight. We have the superscript to the choir master according to the Gittith. No one knows what that is. It could be an instrument, could be a tune. This word is found in 3 psalms, in the superscripts of 3 psalms: Psalm 8, Psalm 81, and Psalm 84. Right. And it is of Asaph. And as I was looking at the Septuagint, the Greek translation, it adds to this by saying, instead of according to the Gittith, it says concerning the wine presses. And that does nothing to further the meaning of this psalm for me. I just thought it was interesting that it had some kind of meaning for the Jews of in between the Testaments, according to the wine presses. I don't know what that means. Maybe they sang it during wine pressing time. I don't know. All right. Well, let's read this. Let's look at this together. Sing aloud to God our strength. Shout for joy to the God of Jacob. Raise a song. Sound the tambourine, the sweet lyre with the harp. Blow the trumpet at the new moon, at the full moon on our feast days. For it is a statute for Israel, a rule of the God of Jacob. He made it a decree in Joseph when he went out over the land of Egypt. I hear a language I had not known. I relieved your shoulder of the burden. Your hands were freed from the basket. In distress you called and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Hear, O my people, while I admonish you. O Israel, if you would but listen to me. There shall be no strange God among you. You shall not bow down to a foreign God. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide and I will fill it. But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate Yahweh would cringe toward him, and their fate would last forever. But he would feed you with the finest of the wheat, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy you. All right, verses 1 through 7. It's a call to remember how in the past God listened. And we start with verses 1 through 3, which contains a lot of imperatives, just a string of imperatives. Sing aloud, shout for joy, raise a song, blow the trumpet. It's a call to festival. It's a call to the feast. Robert Godfrey, in his Learning to Love the Psalms, he writes that the only new moon and full moon festivals are the Feast of Trumpets and Booths. So he leans into the new moon and full moon side of it. James Hamilton, in his commentary, he notes that there in verse 3 where it says blow the trumpet, it says blow the shofar, the ram's horn, right? And he leans into that, and he says the only place in Israel's festivals where they are called to blow the shofar is at the Jubilee. So every 49 years they're supposed to celebrate the Jubilee, and they're supposed to set all the slaves free, and they're supposed to, all the land is supposed to revert back to its original owners. And he says that's what is going on here, because it's blowing the shofar. Where the other festivals, wherever it says blow the trumpet, it's a different word. It's not shofar. It's a different word. You got the ram's horns, and you got like the silver trumpets that they would use. They're different. There's also a reference to Passover. You go over to verses 5 and 6, and there's a definite reference to Passover. So that could be the festival. I think it's probably safer to simply look at all of these and say that this call to festival is a conglomeration of all of the festivals, which are reminders of God's salvific acts for Israel in the past. And so whenever they celebrated Passover or the Feast of Trumpets or the Feast of Booths or Jubilee, what are they supposed to be reminded of? They're supposed to be reminded of how God rescued them out of Egypt in the Exodus. And so instead of us spending all of our time in verses 1 through 3 trying to figure out what specific festival it's supposed to be, let's just say, yes, it's all of them. And I think that that's the safest way because there's imagery from a lot of different festivals, so it's really hard to just pinpoint one of them, when all of them were intended for Israel to come together and celebrate all of the ways in which God has acted on their behalf. And that's what verses 1 through 7 are all about. It's remembering, it's calling the people together to intentionally, with purpose, to deliberately come together and remember God listened to us. He listened to us. He redeemed us out of Egypt in the past. And so we read in verse 4, why are they supposed to do this? Because, or for, it is a statute for Israel. It's a rule of the God of Jacob. Those are the words that we read in Deuteronomy chapter 6 of these statutes and these rules and these judgments. It's the language of, it's the law. And God told them, He commanded them to do this. Because He knows human frailty is to forget. They forget. And so God, in His mercy and His grace, rather than just letting the people forget and just wander off like a wandering star, He gives them, by His gracious decree, these festivals. And the festivals are meant to be visual reminders. When they celebrated the Feast of Booths, they were supposed to literally build booths. They were supposed to build little tents that they were supposed to live in during this festival. It's supposed to remind them of how they wandered around the wilderness in booths, and how God graciously provided for them. Same with trumpets and Passover and the Jubilee. They're supposed to release all the slaves, and they're supposed to all the land was supposed to revert back to its original owners as a reminder of what God had done for them. He released them from slavery. And so they're supposed to do the same thing. He gave them the land, and so the land belongs to God. It doesn't belong to them. And so they're supposed to celebrate, right? He made it a decree in Joseph when he went out over the land of Egypt. And that last line of verse 5 is a weird one. I hear a language I had not known. The ESV, if you're using the ESV, it begins the next verse with quotation mark. So it takes, I hear a language I had not known as God speaking. But it could be taken as Asaph speaking. So there's some questions about who exactly is it? I hear a language I had not known. I think it could go either way. I don't know. I'm not gonna land one way or the other. But we know that this is an introduction to remembering, and then in verse 6, we're told of what we're supposed to remember, of what God has done. And that definitely is God speaking in verse 6. I relieved your shoulder of the burden. Your hands were freed from the basket. In distress you called, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. That's Mount Sinai. Right? I tested you at the waters of Meribah or Massah. It's the place where Israel didn't have any water, and they cried out to God, and He gave them water from the rock. Right? So remember, and these first seven verses, it's a call for Israel to remember what God's done in the past, and respond appropriately. Respond appropriately. Don't. I mean, you can't read verses 1 through 3 and say this was supposed to be a really somber, sad, mopey, boring time. Sing aloud. Shout for joy. Raise a song with these really quiet instruments. the tambourine and the lyre and the harp and the trumpet, all the things that you give like a 3-year-old, right? Julia, when Roland was about 2 years old, she must have lost her mind, and it must have been contagious, because I said, okay, she saw some drums. She saw like a kid's drum kit at a garage sale, and she's like, oh, well, let's buy this for Roland. Okay. It's loud. It's very loud. It's very loud. Right. But that's what this is. It's a loud festival. You can think of people singing and playing instruments and dancing and celebrating, and it's like the exact opposite of a Baptist worship service. But it's all meant to remind the people of what God has done for them, how He has saved them. He saved them from slavery in Egypt, and so they're called to celebrate. Now, verses 8 through 12, we have an admonishment to listen. Hear, O my people, while I admonish you. O Israel, if you would but listen to me. Hear and listen are both Shema. It's the same word. So, hear, listen, O my people, while I admonish you. O Israel, if you would but listen to me. Twice they are told, if you would just listen. And you cannot read that after reading Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and not see the parallel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Hear, O my people, while I admonish you, O Israel, if you would but listen to me. It is a callback. And then verses 9 and 10, there shall be no strange God among you. You shall not bow down to a foreign God. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. What does that sound like? I gotta pause so I can drink, so I gotta ask you a question. What's that sound like? If you know important passages in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, this is a familiar reference. What is it? Yeah, it's the 10 Commandments, right? Yeah. I'd give you a gold star, but I'm all out. Yeah, it's there shall be no other gods. Why? Because I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. He is. It's the first commandment, right? He is referencing that here, and this also is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. He talks about how the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your strength, right? When you do that, you don't go off worshiping other gods, right? So he's honing in on, this is Israel's problem. You read, we just got done a reading in Psalm 79 about how the nations have come in and they've torn down the temple. And they've just wreaked destruction across the land. Why? Because Israel has worshipped other gods. They failed to listen. They failed to heed the Shema. They failed to obey the most basic command. There's only one God. His name is Yahweh. Don't worship any other gods. And before the words are even inscribed on the stone tablet, Israel's down at the foot of the mountain worshiping a golden calf. As soon as Solomon dies, the kingdom is split into 2. And what does Jeroboam do in the north? He makes 2 golden calves, and Israel worships. And it's just a story that you read in 1st and 2nd Kings of Israel's constant idolatry. And this psalm, at the middle of the whole book of Psalms, is hear and don't worship false gods. And the whole problem with Israel, the whole crisis of their exile, is because they don't listen and they've gone and worshipped other gods. And that's what verses 11 and 12 say. If they would listen and they would obey, at the end of verse 10 says, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. I'll satisfy you. You don't need to go chasing after other gods to give you something. Everything that you need, everything that you could possibly desire is going to be satisfied by Yahweh not by these idols. But my people did not Shema. They didn't Shema. They didn't listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me, so I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. He gave them what they wanted, right? He gave them over. They chase after other gods, and so Yahweh gives them over to it. This is language that we read about in Isaiah chapter 6, where their hearts are hardened and their minds are darkened and they can't see, and they just chase after their false gods because they wouldn't listen, and so God gives them what they want. And it will never satisfy them. It will never satisfy them. Chasing after these false gods will never, ever satisfy them. And we can read that and we can say, that's true. And then we'll leave here and we'll go chase after other gods. And we'll look for other things to satisfy us. And we justify it by saying, well, I'm not bowing down to a stone statue. I'm just glued to the box that all my furniture is is facing, right? Or money. Or even good things like family. You make it an ultimate and you lift it up, and my satisfaction is found in my kids. Or it's in my job, or we can name hundreds, probably thousands of things that we chase after. And they never will satisfy, because the only thing that will satisfy us is if we listen to the one true God. The Shema it's not just for ancient Israel, it's for us. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength. That's the greatest commandment, right? But Israel wouldn't listen. They're admonished to listen, but they won't listen. But verses 13 through 16, this psalm, it doesn't end on a sour note. It goes down. They're not listening, and so God gives them over. But it comes back. It comes back up. It raises up. And so the psalm actually ends on a high note, a promise. So we've got a promise of future blessings, but it's only going to come through listening. So verse 13, oh, that my people would Shema. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. If they would, I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate Yahweh would cringe toward him, and their fate would last forever. Those who wouldn't listen, all their enemies, those that are oppressing them, those that are coming in Psalm 78 and destroying everything, they would cringe before God. But he would feed you with the finest of the wheat, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy you. And this is language, again, from Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's found in Deuteronomy 32. They should remember that God listened to them in the past, and they should respond appropriately by listening to him and obeying him, but they don't. But if they would, blessings. Blessings in the future. But there's a problem. There's a problem here. Even as there's promises of blessings in the future, if they would listen, the problem still remains. It's the people. The people haven't changed. That they're called to listen, but they won't listen. There will be future blessings if they'll listen, but the problem is that the people they're the same. They're the same. And if you read through your Old Testament, you'll see that the prophets admonish them to listen. They don't listen, so they're carried into exile. But after the end of the exile, after 70 years in exile in Babylon, God brings them back. And then as you read Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, everything's great. No, it's not. It's not. Some things are good because they're back in the land. They rebuild the temple and they rebuild the walls. But the people are the same. You read the end of Nehemiah, and by the end of Nehemiah is beating people up because they're not listening. They're still rebelling against God. By the time you get to the end of Malachi, which we're going to be starting a study in at the end of February, we're going to be looking at Malachi. By the end of Malachi, God is saying that if you don't listen, I'm going to strike the land with a curse. Your Old Testament ends with a cliffhanger of the people are about to go into exile again because they haven't changed. And so if they refuse to listen in the past, how can we read this and expect them to listen in the future? Unless something changes. Unless something changes. And that brings us back to the end of Psalm 80. These pair together. And so we read at the end of Psalm 80 where we have Israel not listening, and so they become an object of contention to their neighbors. We read at the end, verses 17 and 18, but let your hand be on the man of your right hand, the Son of Man whom you have made strong for yourself. God has to do something through an individual. He's going to strengthen the Son of Man. And then we read in verse 18, then we shall not turn back from you. Something has to change. And it's not up to the people to just say, all right, we're going to listen now. Because all of they make a covenant in the middle of Nehemiah and say, we'll obey now. And by the end of the book, they haven't. They break their covenant. They break it, like each thing that they say they are going to do, because they haven't changed. And so the only hope that they have is that God is going to strengthen the Son of Man, and then we shall not turn back from you. And Asaph continues and says, give us life, and we will call upon your name. How are they going to listen? How can we expect blessings for listening? It's only through the Messiah. The Messiah has to come. The Israel is not going to be able to do this. They are not going to be able to obey. That's the whole point of the gospel, is that you can't do it. And Israel's history, the story of Israel, is just a repeated, constant reminder of the helplessness and hopelessness of God's people on their own. They cannot do it. They need someone to come and obey for them. And that's what happens. And so we read, it's like a magnet. I keep getting drawn back to Hebrews. So we read in Hebrews chapter 10 of Jesus, the one who came, and he says, I came to do your will. He came to listen. He came to obey. We read in Hebrews chapter 5 that he was listened to. He was heard. God heard him. And so now we're told to listen. And who are we supposed to listen to? Listen to Jesus. Right? You can think back to Hebrews chapter 1. Long ago, many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets, but in these last days, he's spoken to us through his Son. What's the implication? Listen to him. That's exactly what God the Father says at the Transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17. Jesus is transfigured. Peter, James, and John are terrified. They have no idea what to do. Peter's just running his mouth. He's just jabbering because he doesn't know what to say. A cloud comes down. They hear a voice. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to him. That's the hope of this psalm, is that they don't listen. They need someone to come who listens. And that's what Christ does. He comes to be the obedient Son, to obey. He listens to the Father. He does what the Father says. He dies in the place of sinners who don't listen in order to justify them, and in order to secure all the promises of the new covenant, which includes the law of God written on our hearts, so that we will listen. And so we will love God. And so Robert Godfrey, he says, Jesus is the solution to the crisis of Book 3. It's good news. It's good news. Jesus comes to save us from the sin of not listening and not obeying, of being forgetful. And so when we read Psalm 81, we are reading about Israel's past failure, but it's also our failure. And we're also reminded in verses 13 through 16 that the only hope, the only blessings are going to come through obedience. It's not going to be our obedience. It's got to be the obedience of Jesus. And so we can go back to verses 1 through 7, and we can sing for joy, and we can shout, we can raise a song, we can blow the trumpets, we can remember what God has done for us through Christ. And because God has loved us and redeemed us through the death of Christ, listen. Listen.